To start our journey towards effective leadership and driving change, let's welcome our first keynote speaker of the afternoon, an expert on megatrends and sustainable business, ranked number 3 on the prestigious Thinkers 50 list of the most influential management thinkers worldwide, and the author of The Big Pivot, co-author of Net Positive, alongside Paul Polman as well. Please join me in welcoming on stage here in Lisbon, Andrew Winston.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you, Vera. It's a pleasure to be here in beautiful Lisbon. I'm honored to be a part of this with you in the room and everyone online. I think my job today, kind of at the beginning of this, is to step back a little bit and talk about why there's so much movement, why there's so much discussion in the business community globally about environmental and social issues, and what this transition to the clean economy really means. What does it mean for business? What do we need to do? Now, I want to take a step back for a moment and take us back to kind of a particular day that wasn't too long ago. Anybody know where this is? It's an American city. What was that? No, that's a good guess. Seattle. It's actually Los Angeles. Now, it's a little bit of a trick question because normally Los Angeles is covered in smog. It's not the cleanest air, and people don't realize there's mountains that close. It's just not thought of this way. Now, this was the cleanest day probably in LA history. And there were pictures all over the world this same day, this same week. We saw pictures in Sao Paulo and Beijing. There was Milan. There was Delhi. What day was this? When do you think this was? COVID. This was the second week of April in 2020. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way to clean air is to shut down the global economy. But something happened in that moment that I think was profound and showed all of us that work in sustainability or climate change or clean energy a vision. Because we end up talking so much about the details. We talk about the doom and gloom of climate change, or we dive in companies into ESG or sustainability metrics and how are we going to decarbonize? How should we address human rights issues? We get into the details and we forget sometimes why we're doing this. So when we get to net zero, and we are heading there, we are going to get there, when the world is powered by renewable energy, when transportation is entirely electric, this is what our cities will look like. We forget this is what they should look like. And I like to imagine that at that same time, the communities in cities, the communities supporting cities, the mining communities, the farming communities, that everyone's got a living wage, everyone's doing okay, everyone has enough. We are building a thriving world. That's what this is about. Now, I've been in this space of environment, society, and business, this overlap. I've been kind of a translator between business. I have an economics degree, I have a business degree, and I also have an environmental management degree. So I try to bring this all together. And I've been in this overlap for over 20 years. And I have never seen so much change. The last few years, the acceleration of what's expected of business, of what it means to be a business, it has changed more than in the 20 that I've been in this. Now, we are seeing things we've never seen before. I think this is clearly a very volatile world. And the pandemic was one of the main reasons that the expectations of business changed. If you remember, companies had to decide what to do for their suppliers, for their customers, for their communities. There was a really interesting moment where Medtronic, which is a large medical device maker in the US, released the designs of ventilators so that the car companies, the big auto companies, could make more ventilators because we didn't have enough. I still don't really understand how car companies converted their lines to ventilators, but I'm not a manufacturing guy, but it's kind of amazing. Now, this was not a short-term profit play. This was not what's typical in business, but it was right. And I guarantee you that the stakeholders, the customers, the employees of Medtronic and these auto companies know what they did. They know why. So we've seen this transition now. I've worked in sustainability for many years, and it was very tactical for a long time. And now I think it's a much larger conversation. What is the role of business in society? Who are you? What are you here for? What's your purpose? And who do you serve? Is it just shareholders? Or is it something more? And what's changed pretty radically is that companies now, not just because of pandemics, but in general, have to have a position on the toughest issues of the day. This is now expected by society. Global surveys ask people, do you think your CEO, should executives talk about climate and discrimination and inequality? Yes, it's expected now. And what changed in the last few years that I think was the final straw was that the investment community came to the table. Larry Fink is the world's largest investor. He has $10 trillion under management at BlackRock. BlackRock owns 2, 3, 4% of basically every public company in the world. And he's been writing a letter to the CEOs of the world every January for years, talking about what he believes are the important trends. And his main topic for years has been now climate and ESG. Now, because of this thing called the anti-ESG movement in the US, he stopped saying the word ESG, but the work is still going on, and they're still pouring money into the field. But he got ahead of this movement, this kind of criticism of sustainability, and said a couple years ago, you know, this work to please stakeholders, to serve your customers, to serve society, this is capitalism. This isn't against capitalism. This is the way you drive profit and growth. And I'm asked almost everywhere I go, well, doesn't sustainability cost more? Does it pay? The short answer is yes, it does, but I'm going to kind of remind us as we go through that yes, it pays. And we're in this incredibly volatile time. I've never seen anything like the last few years. My father, who's still kicking around at close to 90, says he's never seen anything like this. The changes are profound. They're exponential. Things are moving very, very quickly. And we're seeing a change in not only our problems, but the solutions, which is the good news. Now, there are two fundamental existential challenges that we have to solve to thrive, and that business is being asked to solve. And they are linked. They are combined. And one is income inequality, inequality in general. Now, capitalism has always generated wealth, some more for some than others, and that's not necessarily wrong. But what's changed in the last 40 years is that all of the income and wealth in the developed world has gone to the top. And not just the top 10% that now has 75% of the wealth, but the top 1%, which has almost 40% of the wealth. And it goes to the top 0.1%. And a lot of it goes to the 3 guys who built spaceships for themselves. It's at the very top. And what this means is people feel left behind. And it allows someone to stand up and say, I see you. You've been left behind. I will take care of you. This is why we're seeing the rise of populism, of far-right leaders around the world. I know we're in an election week here, and for my country, we're in an election week apparently every week. It's constant. We're going to spend all year worried about our election. And income inequality is connected very closely to gender and race inequality. And of course, the real issue we face is the true existential challenge of our times, climate change. I'm not going to spend time on the science, but I will say that even if you want to put it in financial terms, Swiss Re, the reinsurance company, has said if we don't tackle carbon fast enough over the next generation, we could lose 18, 20% of GDP. Now, that sounds livable. It's a lot, but we've had depressions in the world. But I remind people that a number like that is an average. And so there are a few places in the world where GDP is going up. Canada, northern Russia, where it gets warmer, it gets easier to grow things. But for the most part, GDP is going down because of climate change. And in many places, it's not an 18% loss, it's 100%. Places that become unlivable, they're underwater, or they're too hot to work in. This is happening, and it's happening now. So how do we think about investments in that arena? And I just point out that there's still debates. I still get a lot of people coming to me in business and saying, I'm not sure about this climate change thing. And I point out that an interesting company has said recently that the 2 challenges we face really are inequality and climate, and that would be Exxon. So even though people still come up to me and say, I'm not sure about this climate change thing, Exxon is, doesn't mean they necessarily want to do a lot about it, but they acknowledge that it's a problem. And they're competing now with the EDPs of the world who are really making the transition happen. So we've hit this point, and I think we hit it years ago, where the cost of inaction, of doing nothing, of this huge drain on the economy, is far higher than the cost of action. That's a pretty big change. And it's not just because there's trillions at risk in the global economy, it's because the other side of the equation, doing something about it, is far cheaper. And we are seeing a good exponential change. If I paused here in this talk, it would be a really depressing opening to this event. But we are now seeing something pretty profound. This is the purchases of renewables by companies, not utilities, but by companies directly, right? And this is growing exponentially, even during the pandemic, even during slowdowns. And the fundamental reason is just that it's cheaper, that renewables are cheaper. This is data from the bank Lazard. And for 15 years, you've seen exponential reduction in the cost of renewables. Now, the last couple years have been kind of weird for many reasons. The pandemic didn't help, supply chain, everything got more expensive, but renewables are still the cheapest. And they will be from now on. It's really hard to compete with a variable cost of zero. The cost of feedstock for wind and solar is zero. It was always going to win, and it has won. And it's not just energy and renewable energy that pays for business, it's also the transportation system. This is the exponential growth in electric vehicles and in hybrid and electric vehicles. And this is happening globally, even in 22, when sales of cars were down globally. This group rose exponentially. And part of it is, of course, the reduction in cost, the exponential reduction in cost in the technology behind it. And part of it is real commitment in some of the biggest markets in the world. China has gone from, in just a few years, from 4 or 5% of their vehicles being electric to 30s, 40s. And this is why the largest oil company, Sinopec, the national oil company of China, said recently that they believe they may be at peak gas demand. That's a really profound statement, and one of those news items that kind of went by that gives me hope. There's a lot of dark news out there. This is kind of amazing. And the International Energy Agency and others have said China might peak in total emissions soon. I hear a lot in the US from people that want to go slow on climate, China's not doing anything, and it's just radically wrong. They are moving very, very quickly. And of course, there's commitments. The US has its problems. We could talk about that over a drink later, but we have passed the most aggressive climate bill in human history. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is not about inflation or reduction, is a climate bill, and hundreds of billions of dollars are going into this transition. But even before that money went out, Bloomberg reported that in 22 and now 23, more money was spent on clean tech than on fossil fuel investments for the first time in history, over $1 trillion. We've hit this tipping point. We've kind of won, and we will continue. Now, the pressure on business is not just these exponential changes and the opportunities. They are feeling direct pressure to make their business more sustainable. And part of that is from key stakeholders like your customers. I could give lots of examples of companies kind of pushing their suppliers to do more, but there's really fun examples now of encouraging and giving companies a reason to be more sustainable. The Bank Santander has been working with Tesco, and for Tesco suppliers that hit certain targets, that reduce their carbon, that hit ESG targets, Santander will give them lower lending rates. It's just an advantage, a pure advantage. So it pays. It pays to do this. It pays to be more sustainable. But there's two fundamental shifts. I get asked all the time if I think recession or inflation or anything will reduce the commitment to sustainability. Maybe, but there's two things that are fundamentally gigatrends. They are moving at a scale that is unstoppable. And one is transparency. And that's in the form of consumers who want to know everything about every product. What's in this product? Who made it? Were they paid a living wage? What's the carbon footprint? Did they use renewables? And now it's regulated. There's been a lot going on in the US in the last week or two around this, but there are laws increasingly saying companies have to measure their carbon emissions. And you, of course, have the EU really driving this over the last few years with their directives. And there's state level, like California. There are national level laws on transparency. One of my favorites is Germany launched last year the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which I share only because it makes me laugh because it's one word. Now, I married into a German family, so I can kind of make fun of this, but it just is so perfectly German to make this one word to describe this entire field of diligence and transparency. And I've had people say this word, I won't try, but it's real. And the pressure is building in every region, in every sector. But the real shift, if nothing else comes out of this talk, if you remember nothing else, the real shift is just generational. Real change in our society happens because the norms change. because values change. And I have two boys who are Gen Z. I have a 20 and 17-year-old, and they are different. I mean, they're not just different, but their view of the world is different. Now, I've been talking about young people as a pressure in this world for years. I've been talking about millennials as young, and I'm sorry for anyone who's at the older end of millennials. I hate to tell you this, you're not that young anymore. I've been talking about millennials as young, but you're now in your 40s. Welcome. I'm in my 50s, and I will tell you that to my teenage boys, 40 and 50 are the same, right? They don't see any difference, and millennials to them are funny. They make fun of them, which for being on like Facebook, they find it amusing. But their views, each generation has gotten much clearer on wanting values in their work. I work with a lot of companies, I speak to a lot of executive teams, and even if they're super skeptical of all this, the one thing they never debate is that the people coming into work for them want values. They want to work in a place that they believe in, that they think is standing for something. And this is even more true. Gen Z, they don't see this disconnect that we've all been taught in economics and business school, that there's this disconnect between profit and environmental and social issues. They don't see that. They don't see why there's a big trade-off. And so the fundamental question for business now is, how are you going to attract and retain talent? I think it's probably not too hard, I'm guessing, for EDP to get people into this exciting, incredibly fast-growing world, but most companies are not in renewable energy. They're in other things, but they have to attract talent. And I've now heard repeatedly that some of the old school, oil and gas, some of them are having trouble attracting the top engineering talent. This is a generational shift. They also don't want to come into work, which is a whole other problem, but I see this everywhere. And my 20-year-old says, we're never going to come into work. He speaks for a generation, he thinks. He knows everything because he's 20. But they want a different lifestyle, and it's going to be hard not to give it to them. So what does this all mean? There's immense pressure on companies, both good and bad. There's immense problems, existential challenges. Well, the upside is that we're in this vast shift in the world, a decarbonization of everything. The way we build buildings, the way we get around, the way we manufacture. Our food and ag system is going to be changing dramatically. It has to. Consumer products, everything. These are multi-trillion-dollar markets in play, up for grabs. And these are the real forces. This is the real change. These are the gigatrends. Now, because I get asked about it everywhere in the world, I will say the anti-ESG idea, the pressure that's coming mainly from politicians in the US, it's having an effect, but it doesn't change the fundamentals. The reason companies are acting on climate is because there's climate change and because renewables are cheaper. The reason companies are acting on diversity is because the world is more diverse. If you want to attract and retain young talent, you have to look like them. So I don't believe that this movement is really slowing things. It's causing a difference in the way companies talk about it. There's something in the US called green hushing that has affected companies all over the world. Companies talk about it a little less, and that has its downsides. But the real work is happening. And I will just say that I've seen CEOs start to come out and say, look, and this is my favorite quote recently from the CEO of Coca-Cola saying, fine, if you think ESG is a bad word, I just won't call it that. I don't care. All right? He says, my business strategy is clear. It's centered around the things that consumers want and that solve the world's problems, and that's good for my business, it's good for them, and I'm going to keep doing it. I've seen a lot of quotes like this. So I think the work will continue. Now, all of this also means that we need to go quicker. The majority of sustainability work has been incremental. For the 20 years I've been in this, it's been let's improve things. Let's show that we can have a good ROI on some of our investments. But it's not enough. And business has to do more than just be incremental. And so this kind of need is what led me to my last book, which was, as you heard from the intro, with Paul Pullman. He was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years, and he's really kind of the best known and most, I think, celebrated CEO on sustainability for a lot of good reasons. He's also just a decent human being, which is nice in a CEO. It doesn't always happen, but he's a good man. We said, look, we have to go faster. We need businesses to do more than just be better. They need to shoot for something bigger. And so we define net positive as a business that profits by solving the world's problems, not by making them worse, that improves the well-being of everyone that they touch throughout their business. And for multinationals, that's kind of everyone. And we did ask this core question: is the world better off because your business is in it? And I find that people do pause there. It stops conversation. And as I mentioned, I turned 50 right at during that Clean Air Day in April. I was turning 50. We had a big party planned, and instead we did a Zoom call with some friends. So that was kind of a bummer. But I found myself asking, and I think older millennials are probably asking this: is the world better off because I'm in it? Does my work matter? These are really core questions today. And I think it leads to building a much better business and a better career. Now, the principles of this kind of company are based in long-term thinking, multi-stakeholder. It's about partnership, deep partnership. That's the core. And it is shareholder value. We made clear in kind of 5 key principles that shareholders will do fine. But it's because you do the rest of this right, and you take ownership. And ownership is a form of responsibility, not corporate social responsibility, but responsibility like we teach our kids. If you know the phrase, if you break it, you own it. If your kid is running through a store and breaks something, you buy it, right? We have kind of broken the world in many ways, and business is at the core of it. We have a responsibility. We can take ownership. Now, there are no net positive companies. Unilever's not net positive. A renewable-focused company like EDP is getting pretty close. Like, that's a pure play. But most companies are not. But companies are doing pieces of this very well. IKEA, for example, now makes more energy than it needs on its own stores. So it is net positive to the grid. And it's going beyond that and selling solar to consumers. So they have this multiplier effect. Now, this is good business. No one said this shouldn't be good business. They're selling product. But this is how it pays. We also need to see a different kind of leadership. This is everyone in the room, everyone listening. Now, one of the leaders that we admire is Ajay Banga. He was the head of MasterCard for years. He's now the head of the World Bank. And he's talked in the past about decency, caring. One of the things we write about in Net Positive is caring and about love. Like, why don't we talk about these kinds of emotions in business? Why have we squeezed humanity out of business? Why can't we care about the people we work with and work for? And we need a different kind of leadership that at core is about courage. We desperately need courage now. And it's courage to do the kinds of things we're talking about, courage to lead with empathy, to lead with your own purpose, courage to say to the world, hey, we have some really big problems. We are trying to get rid of plastics. We're trying to decarbonize. We don't know how to do it. And to go out to critics, to go to NGOs and say, help us. But we also need courage right now in the face of what is frankly rising fascism and attacks on democracy, attacks on people's fundamental rights. Business has to be more courageous. It is way too powerful to sit it out. Business has way too much power to just say, oh, we'll wait and see. And everyone can be a leader. This is not just about CEOs. This is everyone. So how do you do this kind of business? I'll give you a couple quick ideas of what's at the core. We heard about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's really one of the great kind of human creations, actually. The Sustainable Development Goals are really a great business plan for humanity. Here's what it looks like to be thriving. And more companies are using it as their guidepost. But part of it is thinking outside of the company. What really makes sustainable business and net positive business different is this outside-in perspective, that we do things because there is a climate problem, because there is a waste problem, because there is a human rights problem. So it's about blowing up the boundaries of what you think of as your goals. Now, the companies that are setting net positive goals are going further. Microsoft has said they want to sequester all the carbon that they've ever emitted since they were founded in 1975, back when there was Pong. I'm old enough to remember the first games. That's a lot. That's retroactive carbon neutrality. Google has a similar goal, but also wants to source and use only green electrons for their business. These are actual Google facilities. So they've done a lot in renewables, obviously. What they're saying is by 2030, and this is an aggressive goal, we want to use only renewable energy, which means more on-site, more storage, but it also means, and they talk about this all the time, changing the system. It needs partnership. They have to change the grid because they will still be plugged into grids. So they're doing things like community solar. And you have companies all over the world. I've been to Portugal before and interacted with some of the leaders here. that are setting these nature-positive goals, not just on carbon, but kind of on the use of resources, on nature. We have to get to a more positive view of regenerating the resources that we've used. Walmart's the largest company by revenue in human history. They want to be a regenerative company. That is very similar to net positive. It's really similar language. And they're doing that by, in part, saving a lot of land. Now, at the core of all this work is partnership. We can't do this without working together. And I found this quote. I was speaking at an event for Royal Bank of Canada, and the CEO got up, and he said this to his shareholders, and then he said this on stage. And I was surprised, because this is a banking CEO. And banks have been pretty much in favor of small government, markets will solve everything, right? That's been the neoliberal economic model. And he said markets can't solve all these, they're too big. We need everyone at the table. Business has to do what it's good at, government what it's good at, civil society what it's good at. And so partnership is at the core. And so I'll give you just a couple examples of innovation that I've seen and been really impressed with. Apple has made itself close to neutral on energy. It uses renewable energy for pretty much its whole operations. It's working on renewables in its supply chain. But it also did something very innovative and started a joint venture with Rio Tinto, with Alcoa, to create aluminum that is very low carbon to no carbon. They started a company to do this. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that obviously there's a lot of Apple devices. But even given their scale, in aluminum, they're not that big. Right? Aluminum's in buildings and planes, and it's in very large things, every can in the world. So they're trying to change a market that they're not a huge player in, even with their size. And what's fascinating is that this company did create low carbon aluminum. They're trying to get to scale, bring the cost down. Apple, of course, took the first batch. They bought the first batch of aluminum. The next batch was bought by Audi for an electric car. To me, this is what net positive looks like. Apple's creating this ripple across other sectors. You're seeing heavy industry come together now. This is one of the most optimistic things going on that's kind of behind the scenes. The big, heavy industry sectors, steel, aviation, aluminum, cement, coming together and saying, how do we change the way we've always done things? Because combined, these are 10, 15% of emissions, if not more. And so you've got now these really interesting coalitions. There's something called the First Mover Coalition, which is not only the producers of these heavy industry metals, it's the big buyers, like Apple did, big buyers saying, we will buy the low-carbon versions, so we can guarantee a market for this. And this statistic is one of my favorites recently, just saw this, that 43% of new steel plants are these electric arc furnaces. We are going towards electrifying everything. And that's how we're going to really decarbonize, and we're going to need an awful lot of renewable energy, so this is very good for EDP and others, because the amount of energy needed from the grid is going to be huge, because we're going to move things that were burning coke, burning coal, into just electricity. That's where we're headed. And companies come together now, even to work on things that seem kind of wonky, kind of the details of a system, like all these companies that have a stake in more transportation solutions, more EVs, has said, okay, right now we've got all these different plugs. Tesla came out with their own charging station because they're kind of like Apple. And how annoying is it that every device has its own plugs? Even Apple has 7 different plugs. So these guys came together and said, we need some kinds of standards. This is the kind of partnership that is behind the scenes that seems not fun, but standards are kind of everything. And said, we need a standard so when we plug in, everyone can plug in the same place. It makes sense, right? This is the kind of work that has to happen. And the kind of partnership that we need now is big and includes kind of everyone. One of the great stories, I think, in climate action has been with palm oil, which has been one of the biggest disasters in carbon emissions. Palm oil is in most of the things we put on our bodies, a lot of our food, and it is one of the biggest reasons for deforestation. Indonesia, Malaysia are some of the biggest emitters in the world just from cutting down trees. And the big buyers of palm oil, and that includes like Unilever and P&G and others, have been pushing and demanding more responsible palm oil for years and failing, just failed for years. Greenpeace keeps putting out reports saying this is a disaster. But starting about 5 or 6 years ago, the deforestation rate in Indonesia started to go down. And the reason was seemingly simple, which was instead of just asking farmers to do more, they started to bring everyone to the table, not just farmers, but local municipalities, the governments. They brought Greenpeace in. They brought the World Wildlife Fund in. They asked NGOs. And the NGOs had some better practices. They had species that could get you twice the yield. And then the final straw was money. The Sovereign Fund of Norway, some of the companies put in money so you could transition. The farmers needed a couple years to transition to better practices. And so you started to see this work. And this is what true partnership looks like. This is how we actually get to this cleaner world that is safer for the land, safer for the animals, better for us. It's how we get to those cities in that world that we want to build. The core question now is, what are your shared hurdles? What are your problems? People tell me sustainability costs more. I'm like, well, what costs more? Is it something that's new that needs scale? Can you partner to do something? You got to work the problem together. And in the end, this is about courage together and about thriving. My core message really is that we cannot thrive in business. We can't profit unless people and planet are thriving as well. And so I ask you all to consider how you'll be net positive, how you'll bring that into your lives and into your work. And the answer to that question from all of us is what's going to save the world. Thank you very much.